The issue of fake qualifications has come under the spotlight following allegations that Johannesburg Roads Agency CEO Tshepo Mahanuke's qualifications do not exist. The Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula, on the other hand, announcing that the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa unearthed some 3,000 ghost workers. To speak more on how to professionalize the public service in order to capacitate government, including its entities, we speak to Professor Busani Ngcaweni. He is the principal of the National School of Government. Professor Ngcaweni, thank you very much for your time. Can I begin my questions with you with this particular one? On a score of 0 to 10, where would you place the public service in terms of competence and professionalism?
Oh, that's a very tricky one. I will place it at 6, and I can justify and mobilize evidence for why I will place it at 6+. There are pockets of excellence in the public sector across the 3 spheres, in the legislative sector as well as in various organs of state. And we talk about state capacity, remember we are including all organs of state. So if you are a voter, you look at your voting experience, the IEC is part of a state, you can give your own rating. If you're a taxpayer, like me and you and many other people, your experience of engaging with SARS, you will give your own rating there. If you are a mother who gives birth in a hospital and in the next 7 days you come back, you get a birth certificate of your child in hospital without you having to go and queue at a Home Affairs office, you can do your own rating there. If you go through, our airports, our ports of entry through AXA flying from Durban to Johannesburg, you have a particular experience of being processed by AXA, you can give your own rating there. But of course, there are many other areas within the state that are not functioning well, and there is mounting evidence that points to the particular areas where the state needs to focus to build capabilities, but also to make sure that those who work in those areas are ethical.
Yeah. All right. So the pockets of excellence you speak about, those would largely be determined by whether you hire people based on merit, and once they are hired, their performance is continuously monitored. Is that something that government often worries about?
In some instances, yes, it is true. And let me give you examples of 2 government departments where they have consistently been hiring as well as developing their own employees to be among the best performers in the state. The Department of Science and Innovation, if you go to that department, the professionals who work there, who are patriots, who want to do the best that can be done. Just over a decade ago, the government decided to expand the national system of innovation, started science chairs in various universities and other research initiatives, and that has been running successfully, very smoothly. The policy was designed by the officials in the department, taken through cabinet, approved, and they are able to interact with the higher education sector as other science concerns. The Department of Environmental Affairs, it has changed its name now. The ability of that department to navigate us through various, storms in terms of preparing us, for the challenges of climate change is exceptional. In fact, if you go through from before COP17, WSSD, all the way up to today, anybody in the world will tell you that if you're negotiating with government officials from the Department of Environmental Affairs, it will be we are negotiating with the best available in the world who are steeped in the area of work that they do. Let me give a small example. It sounds anecdotal, but it's actually significant because I've had this conversation with the CEO of SASA. 2020, COVID comes, cabinet decides that they must give the 320 grant. No one could go to apply for a SASA grant in a Home Affairs office. The SASA had to go back to the drawing board, devise and design mechanisms for them to be able to deliver services to the millions of people who needed the 350 grant without them having to be exposed to COVID. They had to innovate and use such systems as WhatsApp, USSD, as well as email for people to be able to apply. 14 million people who applied, they were processed, 6 million grants were issued, less than 300,000 were fraudulent. They were able to identify those and they are following them up in some instances. That means that there are those pockets of excellence. The challenge, those only, to be honest with you, is how do we identify those and replicate them? Because ordinary South Africans, it's well and good for me to say, well, if we go look at environmental affairs, science and innovation, or SASA, you could spend 350 grants to 6 million people at the height of the pandemic. But this may not be the experience of the majority of people who may be spending a long time in a queue at Home Affairs, or who may be in a hospital or a clinic where there is load shedding, generator is not working, and some essential procedure is not being done. And that is why the idea of building state capacity has to permeate across and make sure that those officials who are in HR, let me talk about HR also in anticipation of the question around the fake qualifications.
Yeah.
The problem only begins with HR. Where you work, if Newzroom decides to hire a new producer and HR writes a substandard specification for that person, you will find someone who has no experience of producing. At JRA, I saw the advert. It's a multi-billion rands institution. They pay the CEO 3.2 million rands, which is double the amount of money is paid to the DG of the Department of National Treasury. But what is the requirement? All they want is a degree in operational management, which means even someone who runs a trucking company could have applied for this job. There is no requirement whatsoever in the advert that says they need someone who's got experience of working in an infrastructure environment.
Yeah.
What does it mean for service delivery? It means that that person who's in that job, who's never worked in an infrastructure environment, the officials and service providers will run rings around you. You don't know what is bitumen, you don't know what is cement, you don't know what their prices are in the market, you don't know what the labor costs. People can just inflate because these things will move above your head since you've never worked in an infrastructure environment. And it is because the HR wrote an advert that was substandard.
Mr. Ngcaweni, I'm going to try and speed this up because of time constraints. Let me start with your score. 6 out of 10 is what you would give the public service. Some people are going to say that's being very generous. And you speak about pockets of excellence. Indeed, there may be, but the experience of South Africans is that of just sheer frustration whenever they visit a government department or even a licensing department. But let's come to the issues you've just alluded to now, those of fake qualifications. If indeed government was doing its best to put safeguards, why is it that not one, not two, over 3,000 people at PRASA were found to have been bogus employees in that institution, earning millions from that institution? Why am I saying this? South Africans will recall a certain Daniel Mtimkulu. This was an engineer from the same institution, PRASA. Do you remember what he did? Let me tell you. He's just been found guilty this January. He was found guilty of fraud because of that bogus qualification, calling himself an engineer when in actual fact he did not. And guess how much PRASA spent under his watch? 2.6 billion rand for trains that could not even fit on our rail lines. So you really have got to convince me, Mr. Ngcaweni, why it is that you think 6 out of 10 is what government deserves.
Yeah, you see, again, it's a problem of the function called HR in the state. And we need to invest and professionalize it. By the way, let me start here. According to the SAQA, the Qualifications Framework Act of South Africa of 2009, faking qualifications is a criminal offense and there are penalties. And that is why the gentleman you are referring to has been found guilty. The lady in the Northern Cape who did the same has been found guilty. So there is now a legal safeguard. For those who are faking qualifications, you will end up wearing an orange overall. And back to the question you are asking. In the same act, it says, this Qualifications Framework Act, it says the duty or the onus is upon the appointing authority to make sure that those who are appointed do not misrepresent their resumes and that the qualifications they have are authenticated and that they are found to be correct. That is why the problem lies with HR. Where you work, Newzroom Afrika, it will be HR that will load fake journalists onto the payroll system. It will be HR that will be responsible for verifying those people on a regular basis. So in many instances, my argument is when you have people who are ghost employees who have got fake qualifications, it is because the HR professionals are the ones who uploaded them onto the payroll system, because in many cases they have an interest in those type of arrangements. Yeah. So we have to deal with issues of corruption, not just in the SCM environment, but in the HR as well. That is why in the professionalization framework we are arguing that we must get HR officials within the public sector to belong to professional bodies so that there are consequences for doing wrong things. We must get project managers and all business environment professionals to belong to professional councils, because Mtimkulu would never have happened if the requirement at PRASA was that the chief engineer must be a member of the Engineering Council of South Africa. It did happen precisely because he was not a member of the Engineering Council of South Africa, and there was no way of picking that up. Just like at JRA, there is no requirement in the advert that the CEO must be a member of the Engineering Council.
It's all worrying. Let's talk about political interference in the work of government departments. And the question for you is whether or not there is hope of ever insulating the public service from either executive or political interference. Is that something that is ever going to happen? Because it's still widespread, unless you argue not.
Well, there is hope, I must say, and this hope is coming from different angles. One, the professionalization framework that has been approved by Cabinet speaks directly to this matter and is building some safeguards. In addition to it, my colleagues at the Department of Public Service Administration, as well as National Treasury, are doing amendments to the Public Service Act, the PAMA, the PFMA, and MFMA. One of the areas that is going to be strengthened in these legal amendments is this issue of clarifying the roles and responsibilities and delegations between the politicians as well as administration. The Public Service Commission is also very active now with this regard, dealing with what is called unlawful instructions. It is more important only because if I, as a DG, take unlawful instructions from a minister, that will become a material irregularity, and the AG would want to recover that money from me. But I must say also, it's interesting how political parties in South Africa, all of them, are raising alarm around this thing of interference, and it is actually encouraging that they are aware that this is creating, it's got perverse, incentive onto the system, and that is got to be stopped. But it's a process. I mean, I can't say it will be stopping tomorrow. And you might be aware that the Municipal Systems Act has been amended, for example, to remove senior officials from being members of political parties, because there are instances where I become a chairperson of a region. Even as a DG intern, I give instruction to a minister or an MEC. And so the legal instruments that are being put in place now will limit this. Of course, there will always be a human factor. That is why we are building training programs on ethics, on executive oversight, and helping ministers and other members of the executive to understand what it means to effectively provide oversight without you interfering in administration of a department.
Yeah, well, that assumes, Professor Ngcaweni, that ministers don't know where their powers go and where they end. They know that very well, but they place these people under severe pressure nonetheless, because they know that, yes, they may not be, in terms of the law now, fire their DGs, that's the role of the president, but because some ministers, it'll be argued that they enjoy a much closer relationship with the president than others. I was really trying to avoid giving a living example, but at the moment, the DG of Public Enterprises is on suspension, and he says the minister not only interfered in his work, but he actually prevented him from doing his work in other instances by taking a junior to discussions about SAA. That's something that is in court papers. I'm not dreaming this up. So, is there improvement or not in this area?
Well, I speak to a lot of directors, generals, HODs, CEOs, and so on. The picture still remains very mixed. You can add in the issue of board members there, where there will be executives in institutions who will argue that the board members are crossing the line. I think the situation is getting better, Tony, because accounting officers in the public sector know that with the amendments to the powers of the Auditor General, if you take unlawful instructions, there is something called MIs, material irregularities. Material irregularities basically mean if Solim Ngambi fails to take, to act diligently in the work that Soli is doing and prudently, because we're dealing with public resources, the AG will recover that money personally from you. As a Director General, there is no minister who will ever give me an unlawful instruction, because it is either I take an unlawful instruction and face the prospects of being jailed or face the Auditor General. So it's better to do the right thing. And the more education that is taking place even amongst members of the executive across the system, the better, because they are appreciating what it means to give someone an unlawful instruction. In fact, the law is clear, and the memo from Public Service Commission is clear. That must be given in writing. So this is no excuse from an accounting officer to take an unlawful instruction, unless really they are holding a gun against your head, in which case you can go to the Public Service Commission. And so we are encouraging colleagues who are accounting officers across the public sector, do not accept unlawful instructions, because those unlawful instructions will result in you facing the might of the law. They will result in you having to take personal responsibility for the money of the state that has been lost. That at least is a story that is moving around. In addition to that, the Zondo Commission also was very emphatic around this. There are even proposals being made by the Commission that talks about how we provide some support and immunity for heads of departments who acted unlawfully because they had pressures that were brought to bear by those who are ministers across the spheres of government. Right. I do think that the system is improving. I think it's getting better. More and more ministers are joining courses on executive oversight. They are understanding what it means to give instructions legally to their accounting officers. And of course, there will be those outliers, and hopefully those will be dealt with through the course of the law.
Professor Busani Ngcaweni, let me thank you very much for your time. He is the principal of the National School of Government. Do you agree with him?